largest fleet in the world today belongs not to a nation with a long maritime history, but rather to the world's dominant land power, the Soviet Union. This video ordnance program looks at the Soviet Navy, its warships, submarines, aircraft, and sailors. The modern Soviet Navy is large and powerful. It is undergoing changes that will alter the way it operates, as well as the kind of ships, submarines, and aircraft it will use. This Navy is no stranger to change. It has undergone many profound and often bloody changes in the course of its turbulent history. Russia's naval history can be traced back to Tsar Peter the Great, who built its first large fleet. Peter's fleet eventually won naval supremacy in the Baltic Sea over Swedish forces. For the next 200 years, the Tsars sustained Peter's dream of a powerful Russian fleet. But imperial decay in the early 1900s and the rise of a strong Japanese navy checked Russian expansion in the Pacific in a stunning defeat of the Russian fleet in 1905. The humiliating defeat at the hands of the Japanese prompted a modernization program that provided the Russian fleet with a force of over 75 capital ships. When war broke out with Germany in 1914, the fleet was penned into its bases, hard-pressed to influence the desperate battles of the Russian army on land. Tsar Nicholas II was blamed for the unpopular war and the staggering losses suffered by Russia. Revolution followed. Sailors of the Russian fleet were in the vanguard of the revolution. In 1917, the cruiser Aurora fired on the Winter Palace of the Tsar, marking the beginning of 4 bloody years of revolution and civil war. Shown here in a Soviet reconstruction, sailors from the Baltic fleet took over the palace. Elements of the Navy fought on both sides. Admiral Kolchak led the White Russian forces in Siberia, but many sailors supported the victorious Bolshevik forces. The fleet of the new Soviet state, renamed the Red Fleet, emerged from the war a shadow of the Tsarist Navy. The Navy's honored reputation as the revolution's vanguard was sullied by the mutiny of the Navy's Kronstadt garrison in 1921. The Communist Party mobilized its forces and crushed the revolt. No pity was shown to former comrades. Lenin came to distrust the Navy's leadership that survived, and he doubted the usefulness of a fleet that had known only defeat. The Navy's fortune changed yet again with Lenin's death in 1924 and Joseph Stalin's rise to power. By the early 1930s, a new Navy construction program began, emphasizing destroyers and submarines. Stalin's Navy focused on defending the coast of the Soviet Union. Japan's aggressive campaigns in Manchuria and China in the early 1930s worried the Kremlin. Stalin re-emphasized the role of the once powerful Pacific Fleet. But on the eve of the Second World War, the Red Fleet was still a coastal navy, though a large one, with more submarines than any other navy. In the midst of this ambitious construction program, the Navy was caught up in the madness of the Purge. Every admiral and half of the other officers were imprisoned or executed. The Soviet Navy had hundreds of new ships, but few competent officers to sail them. It couldn't have come at a worse time.
Vor wenigen Monaten ein Riss in das Gefüge unserer einzigen Bewegung gekommen sei.
From the first shots of the war, the Germans dominated the naval action in the Baltic Sea. Although the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were allies at the start of the war, in 1941 Hitler turned on Stalin and invaded Russia. In a month, the German Navy had bottled up the Red Fleet. The massive Soviet fleet, 500 warships, 200 submarines, proved of little value. The fleet conducted several amphibious landings, but did not participate in a single major engagement. The Soviet Union suffered staggering losses in the war, with over 25 million deaths. The country was in ruins, and the economy was devastated. But after the war, Stalin saw the Navy as a shield to prevent any further devastation to the Soviet Union. Another fleet-building program was started. Naval officers were placed into the ranks of the Communist Party elite, and recruiting increased. The fortunes of the Navy changed yet again with the death of Stalin in 1953. Khrushchev was less enamored of large capital ships than Stalin.
Khrushchev will probably be best remembered for his statement that cruisers are great iron eaters, quote unquote. And having said that, he went out and cut up on the building ways several Sverdlov-class heavy cruisers, saying that the future of the Soviet Navy was in submarines, aircraft, and smaller combatant ships. Ironically, he appointed as head of the Navy Admiral Gorshkov, who became the father of the big capital ship, high seas Soviet Navy.
Sergei Gorshkov, an admiral at age 27 and veteran of many Black Sea amphibious landings during the war, was told to build a navy based on nuclear power, high technology, and missiles. His orders were clear: defend the Soviet state from seaborne threats. Admiral Gorshkov initially built small attack boats equipped with new cruise missiles to counter Western aircraft carriers. The deployment of the United States ballistic missile submarines reoriented the Soviet Navy's shipbuilding program and its priority. Large ships and submarines designed to find and kill Western submarines became top priority. The Soviet Navy today is the result of its turbulent history and the threats posed by Western navies. The Soviet Navy's operations are dictated by the confines of Soviet geography. The Navy is divided into 4 remote and scattered fleets. The Baltic and Black Sea fleets are in closed seas with narrow exits controlled by NATO. Only the Northern and Pacific fleets enjoy unrestricted access to the sea, and their northern locations, near the Arctic, constrains their operations in the winter months. Not surprisingly, the Soviet Union's military power has rested primarily with its land forces.
The wartime missions of the Soviet Navy, and it is 4 wartime missions that one purchases a Navy, are of course primarily to field and protect the SSBN force, to ensure the adequacy of the Soviet second strike capability, if you will. The second mission of the Soviet Navy is to protect the Soviet Union from all threats which originate from seaward. Now those threats, of course, are the classic threats posed by an enemy navy approaching your coasts, but they also involve the threat posed by bombers, cruise missiles, and other aerodynamic vehicles, even to include ballistic missiles, approaching your coast from seaward. And the third wartime mission of the Soviet Navy is to provide support to the ground forces. And that support can take the form of protecting your own sea lines of communications, to interdicting the enemy's sea lines of communications, to, of course, providing amphibious support, or gunfire support, or just coastal protection, protecting the flank of the ground forces.
For more than 80 years, the Soviets have looked to submarines as the basis of their naval power, and it remains so today. No mission is more important to the Navy than deploying submarines equipped with nuclear ballistic missiles. These submarines play a central role in Soviet war planning.
The Soviets will probably use their SSBN force to a limited degree in a first strike and continuing early strikes But for the most part, the SSBN force will be, as it has historically been, the strategic reserve of the Supreme High Command of the Soviet Union. Most of the SSBN tubes, we feel, will probably be held in reserve for later strikes, or for what the Soviets call inter-war use, for use later on in hostilities as a strategic reserve.
The Soviets have 6 very modern ballistic missile submarines called Typhoons. It is a huge submarine, the largest ever built. It displaces 25,000 tons. It is almost 1.5 football fields in length. The Typhoon carries 20 ballistic missiles which can be launched from below the surface. So important is the Soviet Navy's nuclear strike mission and the Typhoon's role in it that President Gorbachev paid a visit to one early in his tenure as head of the Soviet Union. The Delta submarine, though an older design than Typhoon, still remains in service.
Right now, the only class of SSBN being built is the Delta IV class, armed with the SSN-23 missile, which again is a missile of over 4,000-mile range and multiple warheads, but perhaps most importantly, it is a highly accurate missile, the first Soviet submarine-launched ballistic missile with enough accuracy to be able to target our ICBM fields.
The Soviet Navy has approximately 60 ballistic missile submarines, and they account for nearly 1/3 of the Soviets' strategic weapons arsenal. Soviet submarines like Typhoon are built differently from those of the United States. They have a hull within a hull, which restricts space, but provides the Soviet submarines with protection against torpedoes. The U.S. ballistic missile firing submarines, like the Ohio class, are quieter, sleeker, and technologically superior to their Soviet counterparts.
The more modern SSBNs, of course, have ballistic missiles with a range capability well in excess of 4,000 miles and multiple warheads, and because of the range of the missiles, they are able to remain in Soviet territorial waters to conduct their patrols.
These missile patrol areas are used by the Soviet submarines for other reasons as well.
We do know that they like to operate closer to home. That may not be a matter of choice. That may be a matter of having to have navigational aids closer to home or something like that. Now, in addition, they know we hunt them, so that's another reason to stay home.
The prying eyes of Western navies are always in search of the elusive Soviet ballistic missile submarines. Protecting these strategic submarines at sea is the mission of the Soviet Navy's torpedo attack submarines.
The Soviets possess 60-some-odd nuclear-powered torpedo attack submarines, about half of which are modern quiet submarines, the latest class of which, the Akula class, and there are roughly a half a dozen of those active, operational in the Soviet inventory today, are very quiet submarines indeed.
Akula, which means shark in Russian, is typical of many of the Soviet attack submarines. They can dive more deeply than their Western counterparts.
It looks as though the crews are smaller than ours. When they lost the Mike, they announced a very small crew, surprisingly small for the size of the sub. The interpretation has to be that the submarine was somewhat more automated than we would expect, but also quite possibly that the sensors were simpler, so they didn't need as many people to handle them. Now, that doesn't mean they're better. It means they won't do some jobs that we do.
Soviet attack submarines are not as capable as those of the United States, the United Kingdom, or France. They are noisy, so they are more vulnerable. But the Soviets are making significant advances in their top-line submarines, making them quieter and therefore less vulnerable.
They have created, within the limitations of their own technological base, a very quiet, very capable submarine in the Aquila. It is not as quiet or as capable as our first-line nuclear-powered torpedo attack submarines. It is still a tail chase. The Soviets are still behind us, but they are a lot closer to the tail today than they were 10 years ago.
The Soviets have a large arsenal of both nuclear and diesel attack submarines. The Navy uses these attack submarines to defend the homeland against attack by the West. Their chief concern is the power of the U.S. ballistic missile and cruise missile submarines, which can attack the Soviet homeland. Defending the homeland also means defending it against threats posed by aircraft carriers and missile-equipped surface ships. To accomplish this mission, the Soviet Union uses a variety of submarines, such as the Oscar missile attack submarine.
At the moment, the Soviets operate over 40 cruise missile attack submarines, nuclear and diesel-powered cruise missile attack submarines, capable of firing missiles varying in range from 35 nautical miles and 70 nautical miles and 150 nautical miles and up to as much perhaps as 250 nautical miles. Nuclear-tipped missiles whose primary function is to attack surface ships. This is a class of submarine which doesn't exist in the West.
The Soviet submarine force, like the country, is huge, with 317 submarines in service. Though they operate around the world, this force has a decidedly defensive orientation. Though the fortunes of the surface ship have risen and fallen in the Soviet Navy, surface combatants have remained a very real part of the Red Fleet today. In the 1950s and early 60s, the Soviet surface fleet was characterized by smaller warships, many with guns, the more modern with missiles. Larger warships bristled with weapons, large caliber guns, automatic cannon, torpedo launchers, and missile rails. But the Soviets worried that their ships would face the more sophisticated ships and subs of the West. In the early 1960s, the Soviet Navy began to modernize its antiquated surface fleet with warships like the Kinder-class cruiser and other radically new designs. These ships were designed specifically to counter the threat posed by the Western navies. The Soviets built hundreds of ships at great cost. A popular innovation was the addition of helicopters to help find submarines. Missile armament became standard for both anti-ship weaponry and for air defense. Defending the waters off the Soviet coast remains the primary mission of the Soviet Navy surface force today. Compared to their Soviet counterparts, American surface ships are sleek and seemingly devoid of weapons. The decks of Soviet ships bristle with weapons, guns, missile tubes, and rocket launchers.
There's several reasons why they have a large number of weapons. Reason number one probably is they don't have very good centralized command and control. And that means that if they're interested in defensive weapons, whatever threat they're shooting down probably will get pretty close before they engage it. So they need a lot of shots at it. The chance that any one weapon will knock down whatever is coming may not be all that great. So they want a lot of weapons. If the weapons aren't very well coordinated, then they can't afford to limit the numbers. In addition, they don't really expect to replenish their ships at sea. For that reason, they don't have to leave a lot of open deck area to handle equipment, to handle stores that they would transfer at sea.
The U.S. Navy expects their weapons to work well every time they're required to fire. The Soviets expect less reliability from weapons and plan accordingly. The U.S. Navy exploits sophisticated computers to help control the ship's weapons, like missile launchers and anti-missile guns. Shortcomings in their civilian electronics industry force the Soviets to place less reliance on these technologies.
They will have a larger number of Gatling guns, but the fire control may be a lot more primitive. In fact, almost certainly is a lot more primitive. We will tend to expect to detect the target at much greater ranges, probably. They may find that they may detect fairly early, but it may take longer to assign a weapon to that target.
Slava is typical of these ships. Slava is massive. Its weapons dominate the main deck, and it has a dazzling array of electronics. Although this is a visually impressive ship, Slava is not without its drawbacks.
All the weapons topside crowded together would probably interfere with each other, and quite possibly explosions in one weapon would destroy others. It's very difficult to believe that a direct hit on a missile tube, for example, wouldn't cause extreme problems. We don't know how good their command and control is, and that means that if it's as bad as we suspect, they might find it almost impossible to detect targets before they were hit, especially low flyers like exocets or harpoons. So we would be very skeptical of their ability to survive in combat.
Slava's large anti-ship missiles use older external launch tubes. The more modern Kirov class uses vertical launchers, like their Western counterparts. Except for American aircraft carriers, the Kirov battle cruisers are the largest surface warships built since the mighty battleships of the Second World War. The Kirovs are nuclear-powered and are considerably larger than their nearest American counterpart, the Aegis cruisers. The Udaloy is a new class of Soviet destroyer, primarily designed to locate and destroy submarines. The large missile tubes located amidships contain SS-N-14 Silex missiles to carry out this mission. Udaloy class is protected from air attack with a layered defense system, including the new SA-N-9 radar-guided missile and close-in gun systems. The Udaloys carry Kamov 27 Hormone helicopters to assist in hunting out submarines, using their dipping sonar and sonar buoys. The Sovremeny is another new class of Soviet destroyer, but unlike the Udaloy class, it is intended primarily for anti-ship operations. The massive missile launch tubes mounted amidships carry the new SS-N-22 Sunburn. This large cruise missile has a warhead nearly 4 times as large as that on the American Harpoon anti-ship missile. Air defense for the Sovremeny class is provided by the SA-N-7 Gadfly, a missile very similar to the U.S. Navy's Standard missile. The production of 2 classes of destroyers simultaneously is characteristic of Soviet Navy planning. Weapons are tailored for a particular mission. They are not multi-function warships like their American counterparts, equally suited to anti-submarine or anti-ship warfare. Since the 1960s, the Soviet Navy has gradually begun to build up a new capability, aircraft carriers. The early Soviet carriers have an unusual configuration, half carrier, half cruiser.
The Soviet Navy has only lately come into the carrier business. They now, however, have 3 different classes of aircraft carrier, either operational or fitting out or under construction. Operational are 4 carriers of the Kiev class, small carriers by modern standards, but equivalent in size to our largest World War II aircraft carriers. They operate vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, are not capable of operating the high-performance aircraft found on U.S. aircraft carriers. There are 4 of these. There are also 2 of what had been referred to as a Tbilisi class. The Soviets have changed the name of the lead ship in that class to Admiral of the Fleet Kuznetsov, so it's now the Kuznetsov class. The first of these became operational this year, was accepted by the Soviet Navy this year, and will probably deploy to the Northern Fleet and become fully operational later on in 1991. The second unit is fitting out. These are ships which are somewhat bigger than our Midway class, but somewhat smaller than our Forrestal class aircraft carrier. They are capable of operating the latest in high-performance tactical aircraft, the Sukhoi Su-27, the MiG-29, the Su-25 Frogfoot, all have operated from the deck of the Kuznetsov. These are aircraft which are comparable to any aircraft we have in the fleet today, a marked upgrading of capability for the Soviet Navy. Interestingly, that is not the end of the Soviet carrier program. There is building on their carrier building ways right now the first Soviet nuclear-powered attack carrier.
Besides carrier-based aviation, the Soviet Navy operates a sizable land-based aviation force, equipped with aircraft such as this Bear bomber. Yet for all the sophisticated equipment of the Soviet Navy, its capabilities are limited by the shortcomings of its conscript sailors.
The reason they do poorly is not because their equipment is awful, because it's not. It's, in some cases, very good. The reason they don't do well is because of the sailors at sea. If you look deeply into their eyes, you see Soviet sailors who are a little bit disgruntled about their position in life and a little bored with their existence of day after day at sea doing one job. And the Soviet Navy suffers because these sailors, unlike ours, are incapable of doing much more than that. It's the weakest point of the Soviet Navy, and it will take a decade or more in order to cure.
Racing to meet the technological challenge of the West, the Soviet Navy confronts the need for profound change. The way the Kremlin responds to these challenges will shape the future of the Red Fleet.